welcome to Chapter 30, our last learning objective, which is Objective 8. Here we're going to take the first part, talk about the costs of inflation. This is a great test question, so you might get that in the short answer. And then we're going to talk a little bit about deflation, when prices actually go down or the quantity or the money supply decreases, because we've really been focused on the increase throughout this discussion. So let me go ahead and share my screens with you. Okay, oops, helps if I set up the slideshow. I thought I did that, but let me do that from the beginning. Okay, so again, we're going to take a look at the costs of inflation, and then we're going to look briefly at deflation. So again, the inflation fallacy that we talk about robs people of purchasing power of dollars. Again, remember that as the money supply increases, the value of a dollar decreases. Why? Because the price level is going up, and that means we need more physical dollars to make the same amount of purchases. Okay, when prices rise, obviously we know buyers pay more and sellers get more. Okay, it doesn't really reduce people's real purchasing power. If you remember, real variables are not affected by this. Okay, so let's talk about the costs. The first cost that we have are shoe leather costs. And shoe leather costs go back to the ideology that you couldn't have immediate access to cash, and that the only place you could get cash was from banks. And because prices were increasing, right? So the money, prices are increasing. And so it takes you more physical dollars to buy the same amount. So you would have to go to the bank several times to withdraw cash to make normal purchases. So basically what happens is you would wear out your shoe leather, the leather that shoes are made out of, by going back and forth, walking back and forth to the bank. It's a bit of an older term, but it basically says that, hey, there's a lot of resources and the opportunity cost of that increases. The second one are menu costs. And, you know, if you've ever went into a restaurant and had printed menus, or you fixed prices in a paper type of form, you would have to print those. And so what happens is if you have to change prices, you have to change those menus, and that's a lot of cost that can go along with that. Now we have boards and, you know, the internet, and so it's a little less costly to change prices than it used to be historically. Okay, the third cost is what we call a distortion of relative prices, okay? All right, now what does this mean? Because when we talk about the three functions of money, a store of value, a medium of exchange, and a yardstick for measurement, basically what happens is as prices change because of monetary values changing, then we're not really sure how to allocate the scarce resources. Okay, so what essentially does that mean? It means if the price is increasing, some people would believe that you get more value for that. So if you have something that costs $10 and something that you have that costs $1, it's the same product and so on, we could say that the dollar one is perhaps more cheaply made, the $10 one has more value. But that distorts the idea of the yardstick of value. And so that's what we mean by the relative prices inflation distorts relative prices. Again, the tax treatment that we've kind of looked at here, so that would be a fourth problem. It distorts incentives. And again, remember that we found that in inflationary times, that as inflation goes up, the real after-tax decreases. So that's difficult. And again, sometimes people will think that because it's a 30% gain in terms of capital gains, that they don't really understand that you're paying higher taxes because of inflation. So this inflation tends to discourage savings, okay, and exaggerates the size of capital gains tax. Again, this kind of goes to the tax treatment, so I'm going to go ahead and keep this as 4. Excuse me. And so again, treated as taxable income, and we saw that it increases tax burdens. So I suppose if I want to roll 4 into a nice way of saying this, I would say it increases tax burden. That's just a simplistic way to put all 4 of these bullet points into something. Okay, so again, this just kind of represents what we've already talked about in terms of the after-tax real interest rate when you have a inflation rate of nothing versus inflation rate of 8%. So again, you can see the after-tax real interest rate is substantial when you look at inflationary times. It also leads, if I can put 5 up here, to confusion and inconvenience. Because we use money as a yardstick, then it becomes difficult, because at what price do we actually record that transaction? So that becomes difficult. So basically, we know that when the Fed increases the money supply, that creates inflation, erodes the real value of the unit of account. Now here we're making an exception by saying the real value. So the value of money decreases, right? So we would say that $1 is not worth $1 in inflationary times. The 6th would be arbitrary redispositions of wealth. What this means is when we redistribute wealth. So again, who wins in inflation? People who are in debt. And they win because they pay back their debt with cheaper dollars that don't buy as much as they did when they borrowed them. So for example, in 2000, let's say you borrowed $1,000. That was worth $1,000 in 2000. Now, let's say in 2005, you want to pay that $1,000 back. If there's been inflation during this time, so inflation is increasing, basically when you repay that loan of $1,000, that $1,000 is not worth as much as it was in the year 2000. So again, what we say is it redistributes wealth among debtors and creditors. So basically, if you're in debt, you win from inflation. Okay, so now we're going to turn our sense to the idea of deflation. And this is a decrease in the price level, right? So it's an increase in the value of money. And normally it's because we've decreased the money supply. All right, so there's a certain amount of deflation that we have. What we know is that moderate deflation will do a couple of things. It'll decrease the nominal interest rate. That does what? It increases investment in the economy. So that doesn't sound too bad, right? It reduces the cost of holding money. So that means more people might hold physical dollars because the dollar's not being ripped in half, so to speak. So we see that people will hold more physical dollars. Also, shoe leather costs will decrease, right? Because you can hold more money and that money is not being eroded. We can have deflation equal to the real interest rate. So again, when we talk about the nominal interest rate equaling the real rate plus inflation, if we have decreasing inflation or 0, then the nominal interest rate becomes equal to the real interest rate. Some other costs of deflation, though, menu costs, that printing idea, you might still have, well, you'll have that in deflation because now your costs are actually decreasing. So do you want to decrease your price to the public? The relative price variability, again, how do you measure things in terms of quality and amounts? And there might be a redisposition to creditors. So creditors here would win. So that would be the people making the loans. Now their money that you're repaying is worth more than what you originally borrowed. And again, sometimes it's difficult to parse these out. Okay, so now we've looked at both inflation and deflation. We've talked about how to parse out deflation and saw what the costs were. And previous objectives, we looked at classical dichotomy and basically that inflation does not affect real variables. Okay, at this time, we're done with